All right. Hey, everyone. Welcome back to the Worth Your Time podcast. I'm your host, Erica, and I'm talking today with my friend, Clarissa Moll. Clarissa, thank you so much for joining me.
Hey, thanks for having me, Erica.
Well, I've been meaning to have you on for some time. We connected through Hope Writers, and I've just been following your journey for probably a couple of years now, honestly, although we didn't really meet until earlier this year. And your book came out. I have it right here. Your book came out this year, Beyond the Darkness, a gentle guide for living with grief and thriving after loss. Beautiful cover, by the way. I love
Thank
that.
you.
I think the
Yeah,
cover always makes such a difference. It's
I
just like
agree.
whether or not people pick it up, it's a huge thing.
Yes.
So tell us a little bit about yourself, where you live, your family, and then we'll jump into some questions.
Yeah, well, I live in the Boston area. I'm a New Englander by birth, but I've lived all over the United States in Chicago and Seattle and Dallas, all over the place. And I think that wanderlust has never left me because my kids know that as soon as we have a school break or we have a long weekend, mom wants to get on the road. I've got four kids. They range from 17 to 10. And we're an outdoorsy family. We're a family who chases adventure. And I think over the last 3 years, especially getting outside, being in nature, finding new ways to capture joy has just been a vital part of our family life.
Yeah. And so you don't have to get too into the story, but your book, you wrote that based on, the experience that you went through after your husband passed away. So can you tell us a little bit about that particular time in your life?
Sure. Yeah. In 2019, my husband died in a hiking accident in the middle of our family vacation. So
Hmm.
you never plan for this sort of thing when you take a road trip, but halfway through our family vacation, he died in Mount Rainier National Park, really beautiful place, place he had hiked many times. He was an experienced hiker, and it was an accident. And I think that's the hardest thing to reckon with for folks who have experienced sudden loss. That there genuinely are things in life you can't control, and certainly his death has opened my eyes to the many things that I often thought I could control, but can't plan for and really don't have a hand in. And so it's been a process really of letting go, of receiving God's mercy and kindness over the last 3 years, and trying to figure out how you rebuild after something so dramatic enters your life unexpectedly.
What was it like in the immediate aftermath? You had to tell your kids, and I just can't even imagine the emotions you must have been feeling.
Yeah, I feel like I was so blessed to have guides. I feel like divinely appointed guides through those first days and weeks. The chaplains who brought us the news guided us into telling my children. They guided me into relating to the media because his death on public land meant that it was reported
Mm.
on local news stations, in the newspaper, on NPR. It was not a private grief from the very beginning. And so I had that kind of guidance. Rob's publishing company, InterVarsity, they wrote the first obituary for him, running interference for me with the media even then. And so I feel like God just, he lined up these people from one after another to be agents of kindness to us, so that the load that we were required to carry was even shouldered from the very beginning by more than just our family.
You know what I thought was interesting, I'm sure you've talked about this before, is that Rob wrote about death, right? And
Yes.
so that is kind of just a coincidence, I guess. But what kinds of things did he write about? What made him interested in that subject?
Yeah, well, he was an editor for Christianity Today and was reporting on the Terry Schiavo case. So, euthanasia, right to die, death with dignity, those were all kind of buzzwords that he was trying to wrap his mind around, particularly as they related to faith and how Christians could respond in that cultural moment. And at the same time, he was processing the loss of a loved one and trying to figure out what it actually meant to sit next to someone who is dying. We talked about this in big political and legal language, but what did it actually mean, practically speaking, to have to do this with someone? And I think those two experiences just running concurrently, they prompted him to do what all good journalists do, to seek out more information. And having that nose for news, he dove into research. He became a hospice volunteer. He worked at
Mm,
a funeral home on
wow.
the weekends and in the evenings because he just wanted to understand what the culture of death and dying was in the United States and how we could do this better as Christians. So
Mm,
of course, all those conversations over the years, you talk to your spouse about what they're doing at work and what they're studying. It really shaped and informed my understanding of what it meant to die and what it meant to grieve. And
mhm,
his writing has become a particular gift to me in
mhm.
grief because I feel like I have this wisdom that's been guiding me ever since the beginning. Conversations that we had that I didn't think would apply to me until I was in my 80s now became really
Mm.
relevant in my 40s.
Yeah, I can't imagine going back reading his work on this, like almost like he's sitting beside you, like
Yeah.
as a partner in the grief that, he's not, but he is. I mean, have you thought about, I'm sure you have, like what he might have said to you in this time, like what he might have said to comfort you, knowing that this was going to happen?
Yeah, I actually, after he died, we were in Seattle, and I called my mom and I said, "Could you bring me a copy of his book? Because you're on vacation, you're not, you're not carrying that stuff around." Because I just felt like in that moment I needed to have his words near to me, and I went back through and I read his book and I tried to search for those places that perhaps he was speaking to me. And I have one that I laminated and printed
Mm,
off on my bulletin board. It says, "I love her and I know she will make wise decisions if I am no longer able to be at
mm,
her side." And that's
wow.
from The Art of Dying. And he wrote that as a man in his early 30s who never expected that his wife would need to do those things. And yet I see them as a blessing over my life now that he said I could do it. And that kind of blessing gives me courage to be able to do the hard things I've had to do.
Yeah. One thing, like when I think of you, Clarissa, when I look at you, I really just see like light and joy. I hear that in your voice and see it in your face. And yet it's like you're writing about this, about grief, about the hardest things of life. You host this
Mhm.
podcast. What is it called? It's
Surprised by grief.
Surprised by Grief. And you're talking about all of these things, and yet you're able to still have this light about you. Can you explain that?
Well, I mean, it hasn't always looked like this, and it doesn't always look like this. And I think that's one of the most puzzling and peculiar things about living with grief is that it is so multifaceted, that joy exists alongside of sorrow, that on a morning where I may just cry my eyes out in the shower, I get out of the shower, put my makeup on, and I go to work. And those things must live side by side. So I think there is an element of just that messy, mixed up existence that you have to come to terms with as a grieving person. We like to think of grief as this trajectory from pain to healing, from sickness to recovery. But the reality is that until Jesus comes again, none of that is actually resolved, that we
Mhm.
live in a place where we learn to laugh again, and then we feel guilty for laughing because maybe should we not be laughing because we're supposed to be sad. And then the sadness feels overwhelming, and yet there's a moment of levity that gives us hope.
Mhm.
And I think in the midst of those, that the storms of emotions that you feel, we have Jesus, who is this amazing anchor that provides us the stability to be able to say, okay, these big waves that are cascading over me right now, they're going to ebb away. And the joy that I feel may at one point be replaced by sorrow. But in the midst of this, there is a steadiness that I can
Mhm.
cling to in the person of Jesus, to point my feet toward hope and to keep my head above the water when it feels like I'm drowning.
Yeah. How has it been? And you have a particular, you can speak into this as a mom. I'm sure that adds a totally different dynamic in how you go about day to day because you want to be strong for your kids. And so how does that play into how you have dealt with the grief over the years?
Yeah, I think it's a delicate balance of being real with them. You don't want to be stoic because they're watching you more than they're listening to you, right?
Mhm.
And so you're modeling for them, like, what does it look like as a parent to interact with hard things? Do I cry in front of them, or do I say that tears aren't appropriate to share with my child? You're trying to figure out what is the balance there. And so for me, it's been about being ruthlessly honest, telling my kids when a day is really hard or celebrating with them, trying to introduce them to the complexities of living with loss in a way that's age appropriate, while
Mhm.
also not asking them to carry the burdens that really only an adult can carry. So
Yeah.
there it's about filtering information, trying to think, okay, what do they need to know? What do they want to know? What's appropriate for them to know? And using those filters before I give them inadvertently more than their little hearts and minds are able to possess. Because we
Mhm.
know that kids who are asked to bear burdens that they really can't bear at that age, they struggle as teenagers and young adults. And certainly we want to position our kids for flourishing. And
Mhm.
so it takes some intentionality as a parent to do that.
Yeah. What is something that maybe surprised you about going through the process? And then also, um, maybe a word of encouragement for someone that is in that place now?
Yeah. I think that it surprised me that the grief doesn't actually ever go away.
Mm.
I think that there have been moments of joy in my life where I just want to be purely happy again. And I wish that I could actually close the door to grief forever. And and it surprises me because I'm going into year 4. You'd think, okay, I've got my feet on stable ground now, and I can do this, and I can. And through God's mercy and His goodness, we've come so far. And yet we have this companion that will always be
Mhm.
present with us, and reckoning with that, I think, is one of the surprises. I think um, that I wish that I could do away with. That
Mhm.
said, when I think about how I could encourage someone, how I could come alongside of someone, especially in the early and acute season of grief, I think it is an encouragement that it won't always be this way. That
Mhm.
yes, grief is a companion. Yes, you're going to walk with grief for the rest of your life in one way or another. But the deep pain, that searing ache, it will change, that your life will grow around your loss. As you work hard to integrate that loss into the person that you're becoming, it won't hurt the same way it hurts today. And I
Mhm.
think that's a mercy from the Lord as well, that,
Yeah.
He knows what we can bear. And He gives us a lighter yoke. And that lighter yoke comes with time and with intention. But things do start to shift, and that's a grace.
Yeah, I know it's a hard thing to accept in that moment
Mhm.
when you realize that's the only thing and you can't make it go faster.
Yeah.
But it's that control that you were talking about, which, I guess also I'd ask about. This happened in 2019, right? Was it
Mhm.
2019?
That's right.
And then we went into COVID, which was like a national grieving. And so how did those two things kind of intertwine for you?
Feel like it was actually a peculiar gift because our culture is sort of death averse. I think we could say that pretty
Mm-hmm.
honestly. We don't know what to do with dying people. We don't know what to do with grieving people. And suddenly we were thrust into a global environment where grief and loss were on the front page every day, and everyone had to reckon with that. And so I think it made folks around me more supportive, more attentive to my needs, perhaps, than they would have been a few years before. And knowing that other people were grieving around me was also a comfort. One of the hardest parts about loss is feeling like you're so alone, like no one else can understand how hard this is, what I'm feeling. And it was an unfortunate experience to have to grieve with so many other people over the last
Mm-hmm.
2 years, but it certainly gave me a sense that my unique sorrows were also shared universally, and there
Mm-hmm.
were people who would walk with me through it.
Yeah. Now, it was over the course of this time that you started thinking about this book, no doubt.
Yes.
And so what was it about? What made you want to write?
Yeah.
And what made you think this was actually possible, that you wanted to put your story out there? Because it is hard to write about these really personal things. Like you
Mhm.
have to go back over it. Like you have to get so deep. So at the point where you almost feel like you're re-experiencing things. So what was that like?
Yeah. It's often said that you write the book that you needed. And I think that was the case for me. I looked on the shelves after Rob's death, looking for something that would guide me through this. And I found great devotional resources, like Lament for a Son or Grief Observed, C.S. Lewis. And then I also found really practical secular resources, but they often denigrated my faith. They
Mm.
would be anti-transformational. They would say, grief is all there is. You've got to just sit with it and suck it up, kind of thing. And I just needed more as a believer. I needed more than that.
Mhm.
It didn't feel like grieving as those, it felt like grieving as those who have no hope.
Right, right.
And so I wondered, okay, if we took the the honesty and the hopefulness in Christ that we see in this Christian devotional literature, and we actually paired it with some really practical advice. What do you do with all the casseroles that keep showing up and you have no appetite? What do you do when you can't sleep? What do you do when you feel sleepless or sluggish or don't want to go back to work, have family relationship problems? What if we married those two things together to provide Christians with a resource that was like a one-stop shop for that first year of grief, to be able to say, grief is with you. We're going to be honest about what this looks like and what you can do about it. And Jesus is with you too. And we're going to be honest about what that means for your grief experience.
Yeah. So what was it? I mean, how did you get it, get what it took to actually do it? And then, and it's not just writing it. It's like, oh, I also am going to write a book proposal and I'm also going to have to, pitch. And it's like, it's so much more than just the writing. And so that
Yes.
would take a lot of energy. And so tell me about that.
Well, I worked in communications for 20 years. And so writing proposals, I'd helped Rob write his book proposals, had edited his manuscripts. And so the world felt familiar to me of
Mhm.
publishing. And there was a purposefulness that just drove me. I think when you feel like your life is so out of control, to be handed a project or to choose a project that gives you purpose can just be a beautiful way of pulling
Mhm.
you out of that pit. So for me, the book and the proposal process became that for me. It became a lifeline where I didn't know what to take, what step to take in my life, in my real life, but I could know what step to take next in this process.
Mhm.
And one step in front of the other, it was familiar to me, and it's amazing how the rest of my life kind of came along with it. I think being empowered to make progress in one area actually gave me bravery to make progress in a
Yeah.
lot of other areas.
That makes so much sense because I feel like a lot of people in that kind of a time would not pick up a project. But
Hmm.
in a sense, like you almost need to do that
Yeah.
because if you're just focusing on the loss, that can really, I guess, hinder your flourishing in the aftermath of it. And so I can see myself doing something similar. Just, I mean, maybe just as a writer, but I can totally see how that would be a really healthy way to process and move
Mhm.
forward. How have friendships become more important to you? When we're married, sometimes friendships aren't as big in our life because we just, you have kids, you're married, like you just don't have as much time for friends. But I imagine that friendships became really vital to you in this time.
Yes, I have totally redefined what family means. Family used to mean a husband and wife and their kids and their families of origin, on the outer circle of that. But it was really the core of who you were was, these people that you had birthed or adopted or, that were your family. But now family is anyone who chooses to love and be loved in return. And so I have found that I have extended the table in ways that I never did before, found friendships that were unexpected because I see now that the people who show up for you in your darkest hour, those are your friends, those are your
Mhm,
family.
mhm.
And I think about Jesus at the cross, where he says to John, this is your mother. I'm redefining family for you here. And in your darkest moments, you cling to one another. And I found that friendships do that. And I'm so blessed to have found new friends who understand the me that I am now after Rob. And I have these friends who have been dear for decades, who are the underpinning of the confidence that I have now to be able to move forward in the life that I'm building without him.
Yeah. And let me ask you this, how was your church there for you? And then speaking of churches, is
Mhm.
there anything you would say churches should do better or could do better in someone's grief?
Yeah. Well, we were new at our church when Rob died. We'd only been there a year. But I have to tell you a story that just so encapsulates how my church cared for us. We were at the funeral service 3,000 miles away. And I'm standing in the north exit of the church, and I look up and I see a set of familiar eyes. And
Mm.
it is the youth pastor of our church who has flown out from Boston to
That
Seattle
makes me want to cry.
to be at this
Oh,
funeral. And, we had known her for 9 months. It was only a school year, but the church felt like it was important for her to be present. And she felt like it was important for her to be present. And when I think about what the church can do, what the church did well for us, it was that gift of presence. We are so good at showing up with cards and casseroles in the first month, and then the support kind of dribbles away. But the support that grieving people need is that gift of presence. I'm not going to abandon you. 6 months later, I'm going to remember you. Another
mm.
woman at church would bring me a meal every 19th of the month. Rob had died on July 19th, and she would show up every 19th of the
Oh,
month
wow.
to bring me a meal for that first year, which, when you consider we were in COVID times at the very beginning, sometimes it was like, I'm going to set this on your front porch and I won't
Right.
come near you,
Yeah.
because we couldn't have any interaction. So, but that sense of being remembered, the sense of being having someone walk beside you, that is what the church, I think, can do well, and it doesn't take a professional to do it. It doesn't need to be a pastoral ministry. It doesn't need to be an initiative of your church. It
Mm-mm.
just needs to be peer to
People.
peer, people in the pews, loving and walking beside each other.
Yeah, just, it's just that idea of not a strategy, but like a
Yeah.
longer term plan to be there for people, because I'm sure that is the case, that it's lots of love and attention for a couple of weeks, and then
Mhm.
it's like we're still here, the grief does not go away. And so I'm sure that literally everyone could do a better job, not just the church, but so many people that
Mhm.
are part of our lives. So that's really good advice. So last question on this part of our interview. Who did you write the book for, and what do you want the overall message to be when someone reads it?
Well, a lot of times writers are encouraged to create sort of like an avatar, your ideal reader. Who's your ideal reader? And early on in my ideation about the process, I decided I would call her Jan. Jan is my ideal reader.
Mm-hmm.
Jan lost someone that she loves dearly, and she doesn't know what to do next. She's had a lot of cultural ideas that have been presented to her with kindness, perhaps, but are unhelpful. And she's trying to figure out how can she process her loss while also cling to Jesus, because sometimes it feels like God is so far away, and sometimes it feels like she's not sure what step she needs to make next. And so this book is for Jan, or
Mm.
for Joe, her male counterpart.
Yeah.
uh, but it is for that person who genuinely loves the Lord, but feels like it's not enough to simply place a Bible verse on top of that sorrow. It's not enough of a band-aid. They need something more. And I hope that this book becomes that kind of resource for folks, that it becomes dog-eared and underlined and highlighted. It becomes really a handbook for folks, that when you bring the casserole with you, you bring a copy of the book, because you say, all right,
Mm-hmm.
this is to feed your body, and this is going to be something to feed your heart and your soul as you figure out what comes next. Just a
That is such a great
representation
idea.
that I'm here, I'm willing to invest in you, and I think that this would be helpful for you as you step forward.
That just made me think of someone I'm going to give this book to this weekend, actually. It's such a great idea, though, because it's like food. Yes, that's physical and that shows love, but to offer something more, to think about the holistic
Mhm.
part of ourselves that are grieving in all ways, mentally, spiritually, emotionally, physically, all of these things, like to have, just a couple of ways to offer that instead of just one. I think a book is always a great
Mhm.
idea. And a book like this one that is, you know, full of faith-based guidance too for Christians, I think really, really important. Well, Clarissa, before we end this part, I always like to ask people, what are you reading lately? And what have you been listening to? Podcasts, recommendations, things like that.
Yeah. Well, I am reading, I always have a bunch of books that I'm working through
Oh,
right
me
now.
too, always.
I think as I reflect on my 17 years of marriage, I've become so much more fascinated by how relationships work. And I'm currently reading a book called 8 Dates from the Gottman Institute out in
Mm.
Seattle. They do research driven relationship work. And I'm just sort of fascinated at like, how did my marriage actually, how was it so good? And so I'm kind of going backwards and reading relationship books, parenting books to figure out like, how did we do all this stuff? Because it wasn't all that intentional. So I'm really, really enjoying that book. And I'm also reading another book by Tim Challis that's brand new. It's called Seasons of Sorrow, The Pain of Loss and the Comfort of God. And I've got to say, if there was a book that spoke my heart as far as what loss has meant in my relationship with Jesus, it is this book. I'm really, really enjoying that. So I don't read a lot of grief books, but highly recommend that one.
It just made me think when you were talking about the Gottman stuff is I'm trying to remember the book that I read. I want to say that he was a co-writer of it though. I read this back in my 20s and it was something like, it was something about dating and not taking it too seriously. And I'm like trying to Google it, I can't find it, but whatever it was, that is the book that sort of ultimately led me to meet my husband. So
Oh, wow. Very
yeah,
cool. Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. When you're going through relationships, you're not all that intentional. And we do that with parenting a little bit. I think when our kids are really little, we're like, how do we get them to sleep through the night? That kind of thing. But I do feel like it's good to reflect on that, on our parenting, on our relationships with our in-laws or our parents, and our spouse. So yeah, maybe now that I'm not married anymore, I'm just thinking more about how we did it well.
I'll take some advice. Have you come up with anything? Some top fives or anything?
Well, I think as I do reading, the number one thing that I have noticed is that we have this we have this posture of thrill that is just endemic to our culture when it comes to relationships, like date your mate and make it exciting when you've been married for 25 years. And,
Yeah.
and there's a truth to that. There's a truth to that. You want to keep the flame alive, that spark. But there's also a real beauty in the ordinariness of a partnership that's committed. And when I think about my marriage to Rob, we didn't do date night every weekend. And he didn't send me flowers on big anniversaries regularly. But I knew that he was committed to me and I was committed to him. And we showed it in daily acts of service. And I
Mhm.
think in a culture that prizes the sort of thrilling aspects of romance, it's good to remember that good, solid relationships are built on the ordinary mundane moments of self-sacrifice and loving service to each other.
Yeah, that's so good. That's your next book, Clarissa.
There you go.
Well, you are working on a new book. Can you tell us anything? Are you working on a book proposal?
Yes, so
Can
I've
you
got
tell us anything about it?
two proposals in the works, and fingers crossed about what that could mean, but just trying to explore what grief looks like for other groups of people, for kids and teenagers, for young adults, because I think they need resources too that
Yeah.
are gospel based, not simply just gaining information from TikTok on how to deal with your
Yeah,
losses.
I feel like teens and young adults really get like the short end of the stick when it comes to resources sometimes because
Yes.
as I do things online for, Christian moms and stuff, I get a lot of questions from people like, what do you have for teens? And I'm like, well, first of all, I'm not there yet, so I don't have much advice for teenagers, but secondly, I don't have a lot of things to refer them to,
Mhm.
I feel like. And so I'm seeing it happen though. You're saying this, I'm seeing some other folks that are really honing in on the age group for different issues. So hopefully that will be rectified very soon.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, we have a lot of resources for parents of teens,
Right.
but when you're looking for something like, what can I actually hand to my kid?
Yeah.
And I think that teenage years are important to have resources like that because they're not wanting to have those conversations with their mom
Right.
or their dad necessarily, but
Yeah.
they are surprisingly open to the book that you slip on the bed or slip under the door. You find it later on tucked under the
Yeah.
pillow. They're paying attention.
Yeah. Yeah. So, where can people find you, Clarissa, if they want to connect with you?
Yeah, you can find me at ClarissaMoll.com. I'm also hanging out on Instagram. I love being there and connecting with readers and followers. I believe that when you're grieving, you should never feel alone. So I respond to every single DM and email that I get because when someone is willing to share their story, I want them to know that they're heard and known, and that Jesus is with them in this.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.